46th Institute on Ethics in Journalism. My name is Ed Wasserman. I am the Knight Professor of Journalism Ethics here and your host. We are taking a break. Those of us who are in the Institute for the entire weekend are taking a break now. This is when we relax, with the exception of our speaker. But the real work of the Institute is done in the seminar that started this afternoon and will continue early tomorrow morning, continue through midday. That seminar is wholly dependent upon a cast of distinguished visitors who come for the weekend. They're professionals in journalism, some of them are academics as well. And they're what makes this institute work. And I'd like to introduce them to you, ask them to stand and wave, just hold your applause. Now, then they can sit down and I'll continue to sing their praises for a few minutes. You get an idea of the great quality and distinction of the people who are here with us this weekend, which I think, I've been doing this now for 6 years, I think this is the best cast of characters we've had yet. And I'm very pleased. So to start with, my predecessor, Professor Lewis Hodges, who would wave, Professor. There you are.
We're not allowed to do that.
He is the Knight Professor of Journalism Emeritus at Washington Lee. He's also one of the country's most celebrated media ethicists, and a beekeeper and a lover of firearms. So if you're insects, you're okay with him, but once you get into the furry mammals and winged creatures, you've got to watch out. Tony Lee tried to gather some background information of my own about keynoters, and while I'm not the world's greatest sleuth, the job has all but impossible when the speaker is widely respected and universally admired. What do you do when the speaker is described as a consummate gentleman, a total gentleman, a consummate professional, and the like? So I'll just have to tell it straight. In 2003, after a devastating scandal involving a rogue reporter named Jason Blair, who was exposed as a fabricator and plagiarist, the New York Times broke with its own tradition and appointed its first public editor, essentially a news ombudsman who would listen to complaints from the public about what the Times does, investigate them, and publish his or her findings in a column that would be run independently of the Times editorial hierarchy. Our keynote speaker, Clark Hoyt, is the third person to hold that job, and since spring 2007 has been writing regular columns in the Sunday Times addressing questions of bias, accuracy, public responsibility, and ethical infractions of all kinds at what most of us consider the world's most influential newspaper. Clark graduated from Columbia and started in journalism in 1966 in Central Florida, a lovely little town called Lakeland. He spent most of his journalism career in the chain formerly known as Knight Ridder, notably at the Detroit Free Press, and at the chain's redoubtable Washington, D.C. bureau. There in 1970, he became Washington correspondent for the Miami Herald and later news editor of the Washington Bureau. It was during this period that he shared the 1973 Pulitzer Prize for national reporting for helping expose the mental health records of Thomas Eagleton, the Missouri senator who was the nominee for vice president on the 1972 Democratic ticket, led by Senator George McGovern, which went down to an ignominious defeat at the hands of Richard Nixon. Such are the ironies of journalism. Thanks to those efforts by Clark and his collaborator, the country was saved getting a depressive vice president. Instead, we re-elected a paranoid president and a corrupt vice president, both of them forced from office.
Do you feel guilty?
Thanks for that one, Clark. Clark left D.C. to serve 4 years as an editor at Wichita, Kansas Eagle Beacon. I have to say, having once worked for Knight Ridder, that I'm not surprised to see the company regard it appropriate to reward a first-rate reporter who had just won journalism's greatest prize with 4 years in Wichita. Clark returned to D.C. as bureau chief in 1987 and joined the corporate side and served as Knight Ridder's top official for news, vice president for news from 1993 to 99. And from 99 until the sale of Knight Ridder, he was Washington editor with responsibility for the Washington Bureau and the editorial operations of Knight Ridder Tribune Information Services. It's long been an almost insurmountable hurdle among Washington reporters to be working for a company that has no news outlet inside the Beltway. The problem is nobody you deal with ever sees your stuff. Your sources don't know what you're doing. You have very little impact. It's why the reputation of, for example, the Los Angeles Times, whose Washington coverage is long and superb, has languished, and why Knight Ridder whose flagship papers were in Philadelphia, Miami, and Detroit, had a hard time getting the respect it deserved until it outclassed most everybody under Clark's leadership with its coverage of the false claims made about Iraq's strategic weapons in the lead up to the 2003 war. As Times public editor, Clark has taken the paper to task for cheap shots and defended it from allegations of bias. He denounced an especially dubious front-page story suggesting that John McCain had been romantically involved with lobbyists, and expressed wonderment at the Times hiring of a noted conservative ideologue for its op-ed pages. But at every turning, he has brought a lucid and fair-minded analysis that has enabled Times staff and readers alike to understand more fully the commitments and components and compromises that go into top-tier journalism. It is a great pleasure to have him here, and I ask you to give a warm WML welcome to Clark Hoyt.
Ed, thank you for that introduction, I think. I don't think I've ever before been introduced and at the end of the introduction wondered whether I should give a Pulitzer Prize back. I'm honored to be the keynote speaker at the 46th Institute on the Ethics of Journalism here at Washington and Lee. And I'm here this evening to share what it is like to be the ombudsman of the New York Times, the nation's greatest, though imperfect, newspaper, which has some of the nation's most engaged readers and some of the harshest critics you can imagine. My friend Lisa Shepard here can tell you that being an ombudsman is a job that is by turns fascinating, challenging, and frustrating, but always educational. Everyone knows that newsrooms are full of smart, skeptical journalists who know better than their bosses how the place should be run and sit in the back of the room bellyaching about it. Now, after 42 years as a reporter and editor, and a guy who did his share of bellyaching back in the day, I'm actually being paid by someone to tell them what they're doing wrong. Could anything be better? As an ombudsman, you're on the outside looking in, and sometimes you would love to come down from the umpire's chair and join in the fun. Earlier this week, the nation elected its first African-American president. And as a newspaper man for more than 42 years, I wanted nothing more than to be in a newsroom, experiencing the excitement of an election night, eating the cold pizza, sweating out the numbers, and joining in as editors chewed over the tough decisions about when to make the call. But I'm the public editor of the Times, so none of that happened. I watched television, probably just like all of you, because to be in the newsroom looking over shoulders, kibitzing with the political reporters and their editors would have violated our unwritten relationship. Creative conversations might have been chilled with the in-house critic around. I might have seen something happening with which I disagreed, but if I didn't speak up, how could I take issue with it later in print? If I did speak up, I'd be sticking my nose in where it didn't belong, because the public editor must always remember that he is not a part of the news operation and edits only himself. So at a great moment in history, after watching returns on television for a while, I walked out to Times Square and joined the huge crowds gathered to watch the returns on giant video screens on the sides of many buildings there. And I can come back here and tell you that when this state, Virginia, was switched from red to blue on television and declared for Obama, indicating to anybody who had been following closely what the final result was going to be, a huge cheer went up in Times Square. And I'm not sure when Virginia has ever been cheered in Times Square before. My job started the next morning. One reader wrote, and this was the entire message, "America died November 4th, 2008. Another took issue with the one-word display headline on page 1 of the Times, which said simply, Obama. It should have read, "A great man was elected our president," she said. A French journalist sent a long appreciation of Obama that he wanted reprinted in the Times. It was in French. "My English, his little bad," he wrote to me. The White Lion Cafe in Homestead, Florida sent its lunch specials for the day after Election Day. And as I recall, meatloaf was the featured dish. As the public editor, I'm the shock absorber between the newspaper and a public that includes some very angry people. Some of them read the Times and have very thoughtful critiques of it. Some of them do not read it, but know just why they hate it all the same. This is a job that Bill Keller, the executive editor, has called the most thankless in journalism. I don't agree with that. I think anyone who is running a newspaper in this era of cratering revenue, budget cuts, buyouts, and layoffs has a much harder job. But being public editor does have its moments. On the one side, you have journalists who can be as thin-skinned and defensive as anyone else. On the other side, you have people finding fault with the work of those journalists. And this being America in the 21st century, they don't always do it in the most polite and temperate language. My job is to figure out who's right. If I agree with someone making a complaint, I'm pretty smart to that person. If I don't, I am a sellout hanging on for a paycheck, a left-wing radical, or a right-wing tool of corporate journalism, or some other manifestation of corruption. As a lady wrote to me the other day, I am an evil person without any standards whatsoever, and she knows I made a pact with the devil at a young age. On my first day, May 14th, 2007, I was taken up to the office of Arthur Sulzberger Jr., the publisher, whose family has controlled the newspaper for more than 100 years. We sat down, he clapped his hands on his knees and said, "So, you're here. You must be dumber than you look." It's a unique job. It has no written job description. I have no boss, not Keller, not Sulzberger, not anyone else. I am an independent contractor, not an employee of the newspaper, and nobody can tell me what to do or how to do it. To be considered for the job, I could never have previously worked for the Times. When I am finished being the public editor, I can never work again for the paper in any capacity. According to my contract, I can be fired for only 2 reasons: if I just don't do anything at all, or if I violate the written ethics policies of the newspaper. The same day Sulzberger greeted me, I learned there was probably a 3rd reason for potential firing. I walked into the men's room and saw a big sign that said, "No smoking. Violations can result in disciplinary action up to including termination." Fortunately, I don't smoke. There is no written job description, but I think Keller summed up the mission of the public editor nicely when he said it is to hold the New York Times to its own high standards of journalism. This is a role, you may recall, as Ed mentioned, that was created in 2003 in the wake of the Jason Blair scandal. Blair was a rogue reporter who made things up in violation of every canon of journalism, and whose rapid rise and fall led to a major shakeup within the Times and a serious examination of its culture and practices to find out how and why such a thing could have happened and how it could be prevented in the future. I am the 3rd public editor, as Ed said. The first was Daniel Okrent, an author and longtime editor at Time Incorporated, who is an especially gifted writer. The second was Byron Kalame, who had just retired as a senior editor of the Wall Street Journal after a long and distinguished career at that newspaper. Both have said they encountered a fair amount of hostility at the Times. Okrent wrote a book about his experience, and the title will give you some idea of how he was received. It was called Public Editor Number 1. He described a hostile meeting with the Washington Bureau where he was so pummeled with skeptical questions about his role and qualifications that he left bathed in sweat. He described another meeting with the business news staff where a famous reporter shouted him down abusively. This wasn't necessarily surprising. With reason, the Times regards itself as the finest newspaper in America, if not the world, and there was a strong impulse in the newsroom culture to reject any criticism from an outsider who, after all, some would say, hadn't been good enough to work at the Times in the first place. One senior editor warned me before I arrived that that was exactly how I would be received. But by the time I got there last year, I discovered that Okrent and Kalame had worn down a lot of the resistance and paved the way for their successors. The culture was more accepting of examination by a public editor, or at least more accustomed to it, or more resigned to it. And my reception has been unfailingly professional. Sometimes it's been cordial. Other times it has been quite chilly, depending on the individual and the issue of the moment. I think I know how a member of the Internal Affairs Division of a police department feels. More than one person has said something like, "I enjoy your column, please don't write about me." I know that for some people, receiving an email from the public editor is a stomach-churning experience. What's he want now? Even the location of my office was a matter of controversy when I arrived. The previous two public editors had lived in splendid isolation on the 10th floor of the old Times building on 43rd Street, many floors away from the newsroom, down a long, dark corridor, past long lines of metal cabinets holding dead files, just before the door leading to the mechanical equipment for the elevators. When the Times moved to its new trophy building at 8th Avenue a month after my arrival, I asked Keller to be brought in from Siberia to a place more convenient to the newsroom. He's an old foreign correspondent, and he said he couldn't promise me Paris. I said Prague would be fine. After what I later learned were some tense negotiations, and with no department wanting me anywhere near, I was assigned an office right next to the staff that assembles the weekly announcements of weddings and engagements. I enjoy my neighbors, and it's been an eye-opening experience to see how thoroughly they report Times wedding notices. This is a conversation I overheard on one of my first days. So you say you have an MBA from Columbia. Can you prove it? Long silence, and I can just imagine the reaction on the other end. And then this, well, acceptable proof would be a faxed copy of your diploma, or you could authorize the university to release your transcript. My assistant, Michael McElroy, has observed that if all the Times were reported with as much painstaking care, there would be no need for a public editor. With the exception of Keller and his two managing editors, nobody in the newsroom of the Times is obliged to deal with me in any way. But with a single exception, everybody has answered my questions, even when they have been received as irritating or embarrassing. That includes a news assistant responsible for misspelling a name and a world-famous columnist unused to being second-guessed by a public editor. One newsroom department head who is relatively young, but decidedly of the old school, said he does not believe there should be a public editor and refuses to be interviewed by me out of what he describes as principle. Yet every time I have had questions touching on his department, he has found a way to get an assistant editor or someone else to provide the answers. That way he can stand on his principle and I get what I need and I say whatever works. I have no executive authority at the Times. I do not see articles before they go in the newspaper. I do not attend daily news meetings or meetings to plan longer-term coverage. I cannot tell the paper what to publish, not even a correction. I have no say of any kind over personnel matters, even though a large proportion of the readers who write to me on any given Monday want William Crystal fired forthwith. Many people do not realize how my job is structured. I'm currently being sued by one of the world's richest men who apparently thinks I have some responsibility for an article about his brother, an even richer man, in which this man who is suing me was mentioned. He wants $2 billion. Dealing with the newsroom is only part of my job. Dealing with the public is a big part. After all, I'm the reader's representative. I've been in the news business at many levels for a long time, and I have long been used to complaints from subjects of news articles who believe they were unfairly treated, or from readers objecting to some aspect of news coverage. But none of that quite prepared me for what I've encountered at the Times. The newspaper has some of the most passionate, intense, educated, thoughtful, and critical readers you could imagine. It also has some pretty nitpicky ones. One man actually asked, in fact demanded, of the editor who's responsible for corrections, that the Times go through its entire electronic archive, find every misspelled name since 1980, and publish a correction in the printed newspaper. Last week, a man wrote that he has been submitting unsolicited op-ed articles to the Times for years and none have been published. He sent a bill to the op-ed editor for $20,000 to compensate for all the time he has expended writing those rejected articles. He wrote me that upon reconsideration, he wants $40,000. Because there's a small cottage industry on the internet devoted to critiquing virtually every word in the Times, there is also a large public out there ready to pounce on every perceived sin the newspaper commits. Many of these people, who are not necessarily readers of the Times, are nonetheless free with their criticism and can be quite abusive in expressing it. Sometimes they're funny, even if unintentionally. One of my favorite messages began like this: "I wish I subscribed to your newspaper so that I could cancel my subscription." Another man said he did not read the Times, but his mother did, and he was trying to talk her into canceling her subscription, so far without success. On a slow day in the heat of summer, the public editor may get only 150 messages from the public. On a normal day, it's about 300. On a busy day, when the Times does something that really outrages some segment of the public, I can get as many as 2,000 messages. My assistant reads everything, sorts it, and flags me on the trends. Between us, we try to answer as much of the mail personally as we can, but the volume makes it impossible to respond to every single person, especially to those who appear to have been reacting not from their own reading of the newspaper, but from a blogger's description of something in it. I write a column 3 weeks out of 4 in the Week in Review section on Sunday. The 4th week is letters from readers. My contract doesn't require a column of this frequency, and I wondered if there would be enough issues to sustain it on a weekly basis. But the space is mine to use as I see fit, and so far there's been no shortage of material. I've dealt with some predictable subjects and some that surprised me. Since I've been on the job, the Times, with all its many layers of careful editing, has been the victim of 2 hoaxes. In one, the newspaper published the obituary of a photographer who had claimed that he took the iconic photograph of young John F. Kennedy Jr. saluting his father's casket. For years, the man had fooled family, friends, and an art gallery dealing in his work. But when his obit was published, along with the picture, I heard immediately from a network of retired United Press International photographers who knew that it was one of their own who had taken the historic photo. The sad thing was that the Times had in its own electronic archive a copy of the picture correctly labeled with its origin. A simple check would have saved the paper from embarrassment. More recently, the Times published a review of a book purporting to be the memoir of a young white woman separated from her parents by a cruel juvenile services bureaucracy and raised in the gang culture of South Central Los Angeles. The paper subsequently visited the woman in Oregon and wrote a feature on her home. But she was a fraud, a middle-class suburbanite with an apparent fascination with gang culture and a vivid imagination. Again, some careful, skeptical checking would have prevented embarrassment. It took literally less than 5 minutes for a researcher, at my request, to do some fast record checking and discovered that her story was completely full of holes. Neither the newspaper did that, nor did her publisher. I never expected that I would be dealing with an issue like sexually suggestive photos of an underage fashion model. But I did. The Times' hugely successful magazine for high-end fashion, T, published pictures of a partially unclothed 17-year-old model that a few readers and I thought crossed the line, so I wrote about it. The model's mother turned out to be a passionate and articulate defender of the photographs. She had chaperoned her daughter during the shoot and regarded the pictures as tasteful and artistic. The readers I heard from thought they came too close to soft porn. I guess the most famous column I have written is one that Ed mentioned, published in February, right after the Times ran a front page article detailing John McCain's relationships with Washington lobbyists. A particularly newsworthy topic given his emphasis on cleaning up Washington's lobbyist-ridden culture. In its second paragraph, the article said that some of McCain's staffers believed that he had had a romantic relationship with one of those lobbyists, an attractive woman more than 30 years his junior. It said that these staffers were so concerned that they warned the senator and took steps to keep her away from him. There were no on-the-record sources for these suspicions, and there was no compelling evidence in the article that any affair had taken place. Keller and other editors defended the article on the grounds that it wasn't about an affair. They said it was about the senator's judgment in having a relationship with a lobbyist that could appear to some in his circle to be an affair. I didn't buy the rationale, and most readers did not. They saw the article as an allegation that McCain did have an extramarital affair, and I think that was a reasonable way to read it. I believe then and believe now that the article was a serious mistake. Sex is an incredibly explosive topic in American politics. Just ask Mark Foley or Larry Craig or John Edwards. If a newspaper, or Bill Clinton, if a newspaper is going to raise the subject, it had better have the goods. The Times did not, and in the end, the newspaper was more damaged than McCain was. His supporters got fired up against the liberal New York Times, and the credibility of the newspaper took a severe hit. A survey late in February by Rasmussen Reports found that 2/3 of voters had followed the story at least somewhat closely. Of those, 2/3 thought the newspaper was trying deliberately to hurt the McCain campaign, not just report the news. Only 1/4 of those surveyed had a favorable overall opinion of the Times. The huge majority of my mail over the past several months was about election coverage, and most of it, in one way or another, accused the Times of bias. Most of the complaints came from McCain supporters, but a lot came from the other side. Every time the Times ran a flattering photograph of Sarah Palin, or reported on fundraising irregularities in the Obama campaign, or put a story on the front page about Joe Biden's senatorial lifestyle, I heard from readers convinced the paper was consciously trying to help McCain, or was bending over backward out of fear of being accused of supporting Obama, or was allowing itself to be duped by a superior Republican image machine. McCain supporters believed the newspaper was too tough on him and Palin, and gave Obama and Biden a pass. I spent a lot of time rereading Times coverage from early last year through the fall campaign, particularly those enterprise and investigative stories looking at aspects of the candidates' personal histories and public records. I came to the conclusion that over the life of the seemingly endless presidential campaign, the Times had been at different times tough on different candidates. Tougher on Obama when he was the new face in presidential politics, tougher on McCain after his campaign, once given up for dead, revived, and tough on Palin when she became the new face at the end of August. If they thought the Times gave Obama a free pass, I told readers, they had to account for how it was that it was the Times that first reported on his relationship with his inflammatory pastor, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. It was the Times that revealed as an Illinois state senator that Obama often ducked tough issues by voting present. It was the Times that reported that Obama, while claiming credit for legislation to warn the public of leaks from nuclear power plants, actually watered it down at the behest of Republicans and a home state utility whose executives supported his campaign, and in fact, the bill never even passed. Sometimes the newspaper could not win for losing. For weeks, I heard complaints that it was not investigating Obama's relationship with Bill Ayers, the unrepentant former 60s radical who has become a prominent figure in Chicago education circles and sat on boards with Obama. When the Times did put a story about the relationship on the front page, concluding, as did other news organizations, that Obama was minimizing his connections to Ayers, but that they were not particularly close or extensive, the Times was accused by McCain supporters of a whitewash and by Obama supporters of succumbing to McCarthyism. Why was the Times so frequently accused of bias, particularly from the right? Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that in our politically polarized times, the public is inclined to see all news media through the prism of political ideology and to believe all news media are biased. But I think the answer is much more complicated than that. First of all, it was no surprise to anyone when the Times endorsed Obama for president. The newspaper has a liberal editorial policy, and its lineup of regular op-ed columnists leans decidedly to the left. Many readers were sure that if the editorial policy was to support Obama, it must follow that the news coverage was designed to support him too. But the Times, like most newspapers, really does have a wall between the news pages and the editorial and op-ed pages. And in my own observation since I've been there, there is tension between them, not collaboration or cooperation. Second, the Times is in the broadest sense a liberal newspaper, and I want to hasten to explain what I mean by that. The Times reflects a liberal cultural outlook, consistent with the city and region where it is published and where it has half its circulation. It puts same-sex unions in the wedding announcements. It does not give credence to creationism or intelligent design on its science pages. It writes without judgment about social phenomena that many conservatives deplore. Keller recently told me, I like to say we are liberal in the sense that a liberal arts college is liberal. generally secular in outlook, disinclined to take things on faith, non-dogmatic, tolerant of, and curious about a wide range of views and behaviors. This isn't music to the ears of many social conservatives, and it can make them a particularly receptive audience when McCain's chief strategist fires up the troops by declaring the Times 150% in the tank for Obama. Many studies have found over the years that journalists are more socially and politically liberal than the population at large, and I see no evidence that Times journalists are any different. But journalism has professional norms that are supposed to filter out the personal biases of reporters and editors, and the Times has layers of people who share that responsibility. I think I've seen bias creep through, but I also think I saw election coverage overall that was better and more fair than the newspaper's critics would admit. Because the Times, and indeed the mainstream news media in general, are liberal in the way Keller defined it, the Republican Party has put the disaffection of social conservatives to its own use. And they did it again this year. It has been a clear strategy of the party's presidential candidates for a while to make an issue of media coverage and to attack institutions like the Times, or as Keller put it in a talk to his staff recently, to use the newspaper as a chew toy. It's a surefire applause line with the base. You've all seen this week's stories about the conflicts between McCain and Palin. You could be sure she was off message when she told an audience a few weeks ago that the Times almost always got it right. She was whipping on Obama about his association with heirs and using the Times story as Exhibit A, apparently forgetting for the moment that the Times was supposed to be the villain, not a reliable news source. Because the Republicans like to beat up the Times and the Washington Post and the networks, I thought that early article about McCain and the romantic relationship was a particular mistake. And just as I thought a controversy over op-ed articles by the two presidential candidates was a needless self-inflicted wound. You may recall that last summer, before his famous trip to Iraq and Europe, Obama wrote an op-ed for the Times about his plans for Iraq. It ran in the middle of the week. Late Friday, just before deadline, the McCain campaign submitted its own op-ed, an attack on Obama. David Shipley, the op-ed editor, wrote a message that he sent back saying that he would love to have an article by the candidate, but he could not print the one submitted in its current form. He asked for a companion piece to the Obama article, something that would lay out McCain's plan for Iraq, and that would not be an attack on his opponent. There was no response, and the next thing you knew, the McCain article and Shipley's message were on Drudge on the internet, with the spin that the liberal Times was refusing to give McCain equal time on its op-ed page. I think it was a trap that Times editors could have and should have seen coming. There's never been an equal time requirement in newspapers, but I think a common sense of fairness should have told editors that you don't run an article from one presidential candidate without giving his opponent an equal chance. And in this case, the Times should have solicited a piece from McCain right from the start and not waited for him to react. The two could have been run together, but that's something that editors at the Times hate, or at least they could have run consecutively. As it was, the Republicans had more fuel for their charges of bias. And when perfectly legitimate articles in the Times, such as one about the McCain camp's failure to vet Palin thoroughly, and the ties his campaign manager had to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac at a time when the candidate was attacking Obama about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the McCain campaign could attack the Times without dealing with the facts. There was a ready audience for the accusations. Bias is tricky. We're all biased. As I wrote recently, we like news that supports our views and dislike news that does not. We tend to pick apart every story we read, parsing it word by word, looking for signs of bias, and forgetting that it may be one in a long river of articles about a subject that over time present it fully and fairly. We can be perverse in the sense that we are most likely to remember what offends us and to forget what we agreed with. A man told me recently that the Times was biased because it always played up scandals involving Republicans on the front page and buried scandals involving Democrats. When I reminded him that it was the Times that broke the sex for pay scandal that brought down New York's Democratic Governor Eliot Spitzer, and that it was the Times that investigated irregularities in the personal finances of Charles Rangel, the Democratic chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, he said he had forgotten those examples. And he said, and I'd call that good journalism. Well, the election is over, and I, for one, am glad to move on to less controversial topics. So this week I'm writing about gay sex in the Catholic Church. Before I close, I'd like to take a minute, change the subject, and talk about the state of newspapering. We're at a university with students who may be contemplating, and I hope are contemplating, careers in the news business. Whenever I talk with students, I'm asked if I would recommend a career in journalism, given all that is happening. I always say yes, and I'd like to tell you why, briefly. The state of the newspaper industry and broadcast television and just about any medium that relies on advertising revenue is gloomy in many respects. We all know the facts. Ad revenue is cratering. Even before the recession, the business model of the newspaper industry in particular was broken. The audience, especially the young audience prized by advertisers, is moving to the internet, but companies have still not figured out how to generate as much revenue from online as they get from print. Knight Ridder, the company I worked for 38 years, no longer exists. Tribune is struggling, slashing newsrooms in Los Angeles and Chicago and Baltimore and Hartford, shutting foreign bureaus, cutting its Washington staff. Some big city metro papers are in default on loan payments, and others are actually losing buckets of money, not just suffering declining profits. You know the gloomiest news if you read Romanesco. The newsroom staff was cut by more than 40% in Newark at the Star Ledger. The Christian Science Monitor is no longer publishing a daily printed newspaper. Gannett cut 10% of its staff at its other newspapers after cutting 10% at USA Today, the nation's largest circulation newspaper. All of these cuts mean fewer reporters and editors keeping an eye on city councils, state legislatures, the federal agencies that test our drugs, inspect our foods, and collect our taxes. Events in far-off lands that can have big consequences for Americans. It sounds grim, and it is, but here is why I'm optimistic. The media world is in ferment. Old forms are declining, and something new is coming up. It's happening. None of us knows exactly what the business model will be. I think we've got an idea about it, but it isn't refined or perfected yet. And we don't know exactly what the news of the future will look like, how it's going to be presented and delivered. But that's what the opportunity is, I believe, for young people today. You're going to invent that future. When I entered the news business 42 years ago, its practices and technology had been largely unchanged for a century. Typewriters, big presses, a nightly deadline. That's all gone or changing rapidly. But I believe that society needs and will always value the kind of news that good journalism produces. News that holds government to account, news that is accurate and fair, news that points out wrongs to be righted, that gives citizens reliable facts about which they can make up their own minds. It's the lifeblood of democracy. It was also a great business for a long time, and that business is suffering now, but the demand for journalism, good journalism, is still there. Just look at online readership. For journalists in mid-career, these changes have been frightening and wrenching. But for young people entering journalism, I believe you've got the opportunity to apply timeless values to new circumstances, and the future is going to be what you invent. And I'm very optimistic about that. I think it's very exciting. Thank you. I think we have a few minutes if anybody has any questions or comments or wants to throw anything. No? Nobody? Yes, ma'am.
Did you have any questions about possible anti-Clinton-Hillary bias?
Oh, yes. Tons of it. Yes.
Did you ever write about that?
Excuse me. Yes, I did. And I'm racking my brain now for exactly what I wound up saying. So, time.
Maureen Dowd's column.
Yes, thank you. I'm being reminded by my first reader of all my columns. There was a lot of anger. A lot of it was about the coverage, but actually when I went through and looked carefully, most of it was about the opinion pages, because there was a period where it seemed like every op-ed columnist had decided, either both from the right and the left, that they couldn't stand Hillary, and there was just pound on her. And in particular, Maureen Dowd, who is probably the Times' most popular columnist, she's always the most emailed if you look down there, was writing with a tone that was, there were a lot of sexual allusions, it was very jarring to people. She was a seductress who was going to teach Obama the tricks to make him a real man, or Obama, she was castrating Obama. He couldn't close the deal. She was a castrating woman. And a lot of people found this really offensive. And so when I went back, I got all those columns together and read them at once, and it was a pretty when you pull something together, not reading it day after day with lots of other things between, it was pretty powerful. And so I wrote about that, and I would not quarrel with her right to not like Hillary Clinton. An op-ed columnist is hired to have opinions, and the public editor's role is not to disagree with opinions or with editorial opinion. But I thought that the tone of them and the language that was used was over the top, was inappropriate in some cases, and wrote about that, which didn't necessarily please her. John?
You said that the business model for newspapers or news organizations in the future is not clear, but we've got an idea about what it might be. What's that idea?
Well, that idea is, I'll talk about the advertising piece of that first. People at the Times, which has a kind of a unique position in the media world, and I believe is going to make it even if others do not, because of the strength of the brand and the authority of the New York Times. People at the Times believe they see the print advertising curve is going like this. The Times believes that they see the online advertising curve coming in a way that will intersect and cross and rise. Now the recession has clearly set that back to some degree. These changes are structural, but they're being hugely exacerbated by the recession. So they believe that over time that online growth is going to take off. I think there's another issue, and I was talking in New York the other day with a fellow who's a book publisher, but the head of a big book house in New York, but loves newspapers and had a career in newspapers before he went into the publishing world. And his argument is that newspapers are going to have to figure out how to get people to pay online for their content, that there is no sustainable future without figuring that out. It hasn't worked to this point. The culture of online is a free culture, but so much of what is there online that is blogged about, discussed, shared, pulled apart, repurposed, is originally created by expensive journalists who cost a lot of money and who travel, and there has to be some economic base under this supporting all of that. And his argument, there was a settlement of a suit recently, I'm sure you saw, in which book publishers are have now figured out how to get revenue from downloaded books. And there's been an agreement in this lawsuit. He thinks that newspaper publishers need to sue and need to do the same thing, that it's no longer acceptable to have Google News, Yahoo News, Google, and other aggregators for free collecting this content and distributing it and making money off of it with their own advertising, while newspapers struggle to find a way to survive. And I find it a pretty compelling argument. Hey, Lisa.
There was a great deal of discussion about the coverage of Sarah Palin, and that I did detect a certain amount of, a degree of contempt that reporters had for Sarah Palin. What do you think about the coverage? I mean, I can think of examples on NPR where when she was first announced and they were doing a kind of special news coverage, that one of the anchors was very kind of like, she was very dismissive and about her. And I got a lot of emails from people who said, hey, I'm a Democrat, and I still think NPR is off base.
I got some of those emails at the Times too. I think the Times did one story in particular that I thought was a bad story. It was looking at her record in Alaska as governor and mayor of Wasilla, and it began with an anecdote, and it was a Francie Havemeister was the new head of the Department of Agriculture in Alaska, appointed by Sarah Palin, and it said that her only qualification for jobs was that she had loved cows as a child. And it was a very funny anecdote, pretty cruel one, and it was the end of it. There was never any more in the whole long, several thousand word story about Francie Havemeister and what kind of job she did in the ag department, how she came to be appointed, anything else. And the story was trying to make a case for cronyism and unqualified people being appointed to high place, but it never connected these appointments to any public results, job performance, what happened. And in the case of Francie Havemeister, I did my own reporting a little bit, and it was actually a great story in a way that was I would say more damning, actually, but the Times never developed it. And it wasn't that she was a child who loved cows, it was that she was married, she had married into a dairy farming family that depended on a state-owned, not a private, a state-owned money-losing dairy near her hometown. And when the former governor was going to shut well, there was a state board that ran the dairy, and the board said, this thing is losing money, it's never going to make money. So the prior governor fired the board rather than shut the dairy down, appointed a new one. The new board looked at it and said, this is never going to work. Sarah Palin was now governor, she fired the board. And she appointed Francie Havemeister and two other people to this board, and they kept the thing running, losing at $1,600,000 in a single month. And then she was appointed to the ag department and with responsibility for this, and her father-in-law is one of the three main beneficiaries of the dairy. It was a really good story that did say a lot about governing style, but it was never developed. I thought the story had a real mean tone to it without the substance that would have made it work. You know, it's interesting though, one of the most affecting stories I've read in the Times in its coverage was the day before the election. It was inside the paper, and it was about how Palin connected with the parents of special needs children and how they would come to her events with their children, how she talked to them, how she would go back time and hug them, and it was actually an extremely moving story and an extremely sympathetic story to her. So it's always a mixed picture. It's very hard to say otherwise.
I want to follow up
Excuse
on
me.
some of what you talked about with respect to bias. Is there bias? Does it leach into the reporting? And you know, one of the things that I'm just really struck by is that, you know, you and people at my own organization, NBC News, the broadcast networks, the big papers, really get very defensive about this issue.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, the fact of the matter is, and I think this is still true at the Times, it's certainly true of my own organization, the vast bulk of the people who work at these places in editorial positions, and particularly in editorial decision-making positions, do have a very common background in terms of, you know, sort of the Northeast Carter, Ivy League elite, etc. And I don't think there's a conscious bias. In fact, sometimes I think there's a conscious bending over backwards the other way. But I do think that we all live in this world with frames, and those frames are informed by who we know, where we go, where we've been, who sits around our dinner tables. And I don't really understand why there's almost no willingness to acknowledge that. And I don't just mean you. I mean, I see that among my own coworkers. But I think it is true. And yet nobody wants to admit that. And mostly I think it shows up not in the reporting, but in the omissions.
Mm-hmm.
What I noticed since election day, as a specific example, is I do think the broadcast networks and the Times and the Washington Post and a few others I could throw in there have not really covered the 47 or 48% or whatever it is of this country that's disappointed in the outcome of the election.
You know,
and it's because
I agree with that.
I believe most of the people assigning stories and covering them are not those people. They don't know those people. And they just, it's not that they don't want to cover it. They just literally are not aware of it. And yet we say that there is no bias in the reporting, and I don't think it's true. There's bias in the choices, and I don't think it's conscious, but I wonder what you think about that.
Well, in fact, I think you're absolutely right, and that latter point, I've been struck by that too. There is almost, I'll tell you where it is. I make a point of watching Fox News a great deal, and if you go to Fox News,
And which I do.
you're living in a parallel universe very often with your network and
Right, and we can fault them, right?
But they pick up on things that should be part of the overall discourse. I absolutely agree with that. And in the days after the election, the Fox News has been focusing a tremendous amount on the losers. And the Times, I don't want to get too categorical because every time I get anecdotal, somebody can throw something up. But my overall impression, without going back and studying it, is that the Times has spent a great deal more space on the joy of
the whole nation.
Of the whole nation, of African Americans, of young people, of the world. And you're right, 46 million people voted for the other guy. What are they thinking now? How do they feel?
What do they think about McCain's concession speech in which he said, now we need to all line up behind the winner and we're all one country? Well, what's their reaction to that? And I know that if Obama had lost, all of our news organizations would be doing a lot of coverage about
despair. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So that's where I see.
No, I think that's an extremely valid point. Ma'am?
Zach's the cow lover. I assume you wrote a column about that?
Yes.
And reported what you had reported?
Yeah.
So what happened after that? Did the staff of the New York Times pick up on that story and further explore that? Or did that anecdote and your reporting just die down? Because it is a hell of a story.
No, the Times did not do further reporting on it. No.
Well, I know, but no one else picked it up or anything. They didn't send other reporters to chase it down.
I've not seen it anywhere. There's a blogger in Alaska who's done even more about it, but you don't know how accurate it all is. But no, it never. You know, the thing washed out. There was just so much coming, and things wash by, and the opportunity passes, and the entire another bias of our business is we don't go back to things. We're always looking ahead and going forward. Ivan?
I'm wondering about a structural question. What are the resources that the Times gives you to do your job? Do you have like a production team or any staff that you're working with? Or do you have resources?
You are looking at 50% of the public editor staff. The other is an assistant I have, a full-time assistant who. Well, that's not fair. And then the third, there are two other people who help us. One is I have a dedicated copy editor who reads, because I don't have an editor.
You're your own editor. I was thinking, how does that work in practice?
Well, every column is first read by my wife, and who makes suggestions and catches a lot of things. and it doesn't go anywhere until after that. And then it goes to a copy editor who reads it and goes through it. And there's also a different editor who handles, once every 3-4 weeks I publish letters from readers, and there's a different copy editor who copy edits those. But it's basically, it's me and my assistant during the week going through messages, looking at the paper, sort of trying to figure out what's something that's a useful, either to explain to the public, to investigate because something might be wrong, or to explain to the Times. I think I have two distinct audiences. You know, a large public audience, and I think I've got an audience in the Times that I have obligations to.
So if you wanted to commission research on the Times, like a more extensive content review, would you be able to go to the paper and say, I want to do this study, can you give me the cash to do it?
Yeah, I've not had occasion, I did a more extensive content study, and what I did was go up to Columbia Journalism School and get a professor there, Dick Wald, who's a wonderful fellow who's had a long career back at the old New York Herald Tribune at 2 networks, I think NBC being one of them. He was president of NBC News. And I got one of Dick's classes, undertook a big content survey at my behest on the use of anonymous sources. But yeah, I'll give you an example from my predecessor. There was a story in the New York Times Sunday magazine it was something about abuse of women, I believe, in Latin America, and it cited some court case, and somebody wrote to the public editor and said, this is a bunch of hooey, it isn't true. So he hired a reporter in the country, and I forget where it was, Ecuador, I don't remember. And the reporter went to the courthouse and got all the records, and then the public editor, meaning the Times, paid to have everything translated, and he went through it, and in fact, it was all a bunch of hooey, as reported in the magazine. It was wrong. So yeah, I don't feel constrained at all by budget.
Do you have the library do searches for you?
No, we do searches, or there's a research staff, and I've asked them to do searches a couple of times.
So Clark, suppose that Sulzberger came back to you and said, you know, I know what we agreed, but we can change this agreement if we consent, and maybe you should take over the Times.
I'd say yes.
Why not? Are there things that you would change? Have you kept a mental, what would you do differently?
You know, I sort of, in the back of my mind somewhere, I'm sort of keeping a file like that, because I think at some valedictory point I want to examine some of those questions. One of the things that I believed going in, and I believe even now, it's not only true of the Times, it's true of news organizations in general, but the Times has had a couple of spectacular examples of it. I think that news organizations, for all the culture about accountability, journalism, and investigative, and, you know, trust but verify, and if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. The truth is that too often newspapers, and the Times has had some bad examples, let their guard down and are not properly skeptical about things. The Iraq War was one dramatic example. Another was the famous Duke rape case, in which the Times really kind of swallowed the prosecutor's official line, and it turned out to be a bunch of lies. I think that those reflexes need to be constantly reinforced at the Times and lots of places. Ann?
What do you think that the role of a public editor or an ombudsman be more largely explored to help rebuild people's faith in journalism and in the information they get? Could you imagine a larger way that you could do this job, or that a group of people could do this job with you, or something that could influence people's belief in journalism and whether it's worthwhile?
You know, that's a really good question, and I constantly think about, are there ways that I could do this in a better way or have a more impact? And Lisa is shaking her head yes, and I suspect you have the same conversation with yourself. And you know, I would love suggestions about that, about ways to help. But I think just the, you know, I operate with this assumption, which may not be correct, that just the existence of a good functioning ombudsman in a news organization helps with credibility. But it's only going to be one piece of a much larger puzzle. I mean, a lot of other things have to happen.